The evening sky painted soft orange streaks across the city as 16-year-old Anthony made his way home from basketball practice. His muscles were tired but satisfied after a good workout, and the cool autumn breeze felt refreshing against his skin. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of children playing in their yards. Anthony had grown up in this community, where his father served as the police chief. He'd always felt safe here, knowing most of the officers by name and frequently joining them at community events. Today, he wore his usual after-practice outfit, a gray hoodie with his school's basketball team logo, black track pants, and his favorite sneakers. His gym bag, heavy with practice gear and homework, hung comfortably over his shoulder. As he walked past the local coffee shop, Anthony noticed a police cruiser slowing down beside him. He didn't recognize it as one of the usual patrol cars from his father's precinct, but that wasn't unusual. They'd gotten some new transfers recently. What was unusual was the way the car crept alongside him, like a predator stalking its prey. The cruiser's window rolled down, revealing Officer Wilson, a man Anthony had never seen before. Something about the officer's stern expression made Anthony's stomach tighten. He'd seen that look before, not directed at him, but at others who fit a description. "Hey you, stop right there," Officer Wilson called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Anthony froze mid-step, his heart beginning to race despite knowing he'd done nothing wrong. The officer stepped out of his car, one hand resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape Anthony's notice. The street wasn't empty anymore. A few people had slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Thompson, who ran the flower shop, paused while watering her storefront plants. Mr. Rivera stopped sweeping outside his restaurant. They all knew Anthony. He'd grown up before their eyes, helped carry their groceries, shoveled their sidewalks in winter. "What's in the bag?" Officer Wilson demanded, taking deliberate steps toward Anthony. His boots seemed to echo against the sidewalk, each step heightening the tension in the air. "Just my basketball gear and schoolbooks, sir," Anthony replied calmly, drawing on years of his father's advice about staying composed in difficult situations. "I'm coming back from practice at the high school." "Put it down." Slowly, Wilson ordered, his hands still hovering near his weapon. The evening breeze had picked up, rustling through nearby trees and carrying whispers from the growing number of onlookers. Anthony could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably his mom wondering why he wasn't home yet, but he knew better than to reach for it now. Instead, he carefully lowered his gym bag to the ground, maintaining eye contact with Officer Wilson, trying to convey both compliance and dignity. The sky's orange glow had deepened to purple and streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting harsh shadows across the scene. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere, a car door slammed. But on this stretch of sidewalk, time seemed to slow down as Anthony stood face to face with Officer Wilson, neither of them knowing that this moment would soon spark a chain of events that would change their community forever. The familiar streets where Anthony had played as a child suddenly felt foreign and hostile. The same sidewalks he'd skateboarded on, the same corners where he'd sold lemonade, now seemed to be closing in around him. His father's badge, which had always felt like a shield of protection, now seemed distant and powerless. As Officer Wilson took another step forward, Anthony could smell the coffee on his breath and see the nameplate on his crisp uniform. The evening had started like any other Tuesday, but now stood on the brink of becoming something much more significant, a moment that would test not just Anthony's character, but the varied fabric of their community's relationships and trust. Officer Wilson circled Anthony's gym bag like a hawk, his shadow long and dark against the pavement. The evening air had grown colder, and goosebumps rose on Anthony's arms, though not from the chill alone. The officer's boots scuffed against the concrete as he moved, each step deliberate and threatening. "ID," Wilson barked, holding out his hand without looking at Anthony's face. The streetlight above them flickered, casting an unsteady glow over the scene. "Sir, I'm Anthony, the police chief's son," he explained, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "My father is chief." "Yeah, right," Wilson cut him off with a harsh laugh that echoed down the quiet street. "And I'm the mayor. Sit down on the curb. Now." The concrete was cold and damp beneath Anthony as he lowered himself down. His basketball shorts offered little protection against the rough surface, but he knew better than to complain. Nearby, Mr. Rivera had stepped fully outside his restaurant, phone in hand, watching with concerned eyes. Officer Wilson grabbed the gym bag and unzipped it roughly, the sound slicing through the tense silence. He appended the bag, and Anthony watched helplessly as his belongings scattered across the wet sidewalk. His basketball shoes clattered against the ground. His history textbook fell open, pages bending against the damp concrete. His phone charger uncoiled like a startled snake. "What's this?" Wilson demanded, pointing at Anthony's phone charger with his foot. "Looks like it could be a weapon." "It's just my phone charger, sir," Anthony replied, fighting to keep his voice from trembling. His homework assignments were getting soaked, the ink beginning to run on his carefully completed math problems. The protein bar his mom had packed lay in a puddle, its wrapper gleaming under the streetlight. The crowd of onlookers had grown. Mrs. Thompson from the flower shop had stepped closer, her watering can forgotten and dripping beside her. Two high school students Anthony recognized from his chemistry class had stopped their bikes, watching with wide eyes. An elderly couple stood frozen in the doorway of the coffee shop, their evening walk interrupted by the unfolding scene. "When kids like you start talking back," Wilson said, kicking Anthony's water bottle, sending it rolling toward the gutter, "that's when we have problems. You people need to learn respect." Anthony's chest tightened at the words "you people." He'd heard stories about moments like this from friends and relatives, but experiencing it firsthand made his stomach churn. The proud basketball team hoodie he wore felt like it was suffocating him now. A car slowed as it passed, the driver craning their neck to watch. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the chief's boy?" The words floated on the evening air, but Officer Wilson seemed not to hear them, or perhaps he chose not to. The dampness from the curb had seeped through Anthony's clothes, making him shiver. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, probably his father now, wondering why he wasn't answering his mother's calls. The thought of his parents gave him strength, but it also filled him with a deep sadness. His father had worked so hard to build trust between the police and the community, and now this? "Stand up," Wilson commanded suddenly, his voice cutting through Anthony's thoughts. "Empty your pockets." Slowly. As Anthony began to rise, he noticed more phones coming out among the spectators. Their screens glowed like fireflies in the gathering dusk, capturing every moment of his humiliation. The same community members who had cheered for him at basketball games now stood witness to his degradation, their faces a mix of concern, anger, and helplessness. What had started as a routine walk home from practice had transformed into something that would leave scars, not physical ones, but the kind that reshape a person's understanding of the world. The warm autumn evening had turned cold with more than just the setting sun, and Anthony knew that after tonight, nothing would be quite the same. The crowd continued to grow as more people stopped to witness the scene unfolding on their usually peaceful street. Among them was Lisa Chen, a local newspaper reporter who had covered countless community events where Anthony and his father had spoken about building bridges between law enforcement and neighborhoods. Lisa's journalist instincts kicked in immediately. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands trembling slightly with anger at what she was seeing. The evening light caught the lens of her camera, creating a small flash that drew Officer Wilson's attention. "Step back, all of you," Wilson shouted at the gathering crowd, his voice echoing off the storefront windows. "This is police business." But the onlookers didn't move. Instead, more phones rose into the air, their screens glowing like silent witnesses in the deepening twilight. Mr. Rivera had already uploaded a live video to the community Facebook group, and comments were pouring in rapidly. "That's Chief Johnson's boy," someone in the crowd called out. "I've known him since he was knee-high. He plays basketball with my son," another voice added. "He's a good kid." Officer Wilson's face reddened at the comments, but he doubled down on his aggressive stance. "I said step back," he barked, his hand still hovering near his holster. "Or you'll all be charged with interfering with police business." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but it only seemed to strengthen the resolve of the witnesses. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her usually quiet demeanor replaced with fierce determination. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, her phone steady in her hand. "This isn't right, and you know it." A city bus stopped at the corner, and several passengers pressed their faces against the windows. The driver, who had watched Anthony grow up at the bus stop over the years, reached for his own phone to document what was happening. The evening news van pulled up. Someone had called the station. A young reporter jumped out with her cameraman, but before they could get close, Officer Wilson moved to block their view, inadvertently creating an even more compelling scene of attempted censorship. Through it all, Anthony remained on the curb, his belongings still scattered around him like fallen leaves. His homework papers fluttered in the breeze, some already carried away by the wind. His basketball rolled slowly toward the gutter, the school logo barely visible in the fading light. The growing crowd had created a protective semicircle around Anthony, though they maintained their distance as required. Their presence spoke volumes. This was their community, their neighbor, their friend's child being humiliated for no reason. "My son wants to be a police officer," a mother in the crowd said loudly, her voice breaking. Is this what he has to look forward to? Being on either end of this kind of treatment? The words seemed to hit home with several observers. An older gentleman who had been walking his dog wiped tears from his eyes. The dog sat quietly, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Lisa Chen moved carefully to get a better angle with her phone, documenting not just the officer's actions but the community's reaction. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about their neighborhood, their values, their future. A young boy tapped on his father's sleeve and asked in a loud whisper, "Dad, why is the police officer being mean to Anthony? He helps me with my basketball shots at the park." The question hung in the air, its innocence cutting through the tension like a knife. Several people looked down, fighting back tears. This was the reality they had to explain to their children, how someone sworn to protect could become a source of fear and humiliation. The sun had almost completely set now, and the streetlights cast harsh shadows across everyone's faces. Cars continued to slow as they passed, some stopping completely. The sidewalk was now crowded with witnesses, all standing in silent solidarity, their phones recording every moment of what was quickly becoming a pivotal event in their community's history. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Someone had finally managed to reach the police station. But for Anthony, still sitting on the cold curb with his possessions scattered around him, those few minutes of waiting would feel like an eternity, minutes that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching. Anthony's phone buzzed again in his pocket, and this time he couldn't resist. His parents must be worried sick. Slowly, carefully, he reached toward his pocket, making sure Officer Wilson could see his movements. "I said don't move," Wilson snapped, taking 2 quick steps forward. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "Please, sir," Anthony said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I just want to call my father. He's probably worried." "I don't care if your father is the president," Wilson interrupted, moving closer. The crowd tensed collectively, dozens of phones still recording. "Put your hands on the ground. Now." But Anthony had already pulled his phone halfway out of his pocket. In the glow of the screen, he could see missed calls from both his parents. That moment of hesitation was all it took. Officer Wilson lunged forward, grabbing Anthony's shoulder roughly. The sudden movement caused Anthony to lose his balance on the wet curb. Time seemed to slow down as he fell backward, his head connecting with the concrete edge with a dull thud that made the crowd gasp. "Hey!" A deep voice boomed from down the street. Coach Thompson, Anthony's basketball coach, pushed through the crowd. He'd been driving home when he spotted the commotion outside Mr. Rivero's restaurant. "What do you think you're doing?" The coach, still in his teaching clothes and carrying his gym bag, moved toward Anthony with purposeful strides. His presence seemed to fill the entire sidewalk, and even Officer Wilson took a small step back. "Stay back, sir," Wilson warned, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. The coach was well known in the community, not just as a teacher, but as a former police officer himself. "That boy's head hit the concrete," Coach Thompson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He needs medical attention." He knelt beside Anthony, who was slowly sitting up, looking dazed. "You okay, son?" The crowd had grown deathly quiet. Someone was already on the phone with emergency services. Mrs. Thompson from the flower shop had tears streaming down her face, her phone still recording everything. "I'm okay, Coach," Anthony mumbled, though his hand went to the back of his head. When he brought it forward, there was no blood, but a bump was already forming. "Officer," Coach Thompson said, turning to face Wilson, I've known this young man since he was in middle school. He's the police chief's son, and you've just assaulted him on camera in front of 24 witnesses." Wilson's face paled slightly, but he stood his ground. He was reaching for something. His phone. Several voices from the crowd said in unison. We all saw it. The evening had grown darker, but the street was now lit by the headlights of stopped cars and the glow of dozens of phones. The air felt electric with tension and anticipation. In the distance, more sirens could be heard approaching. Anthony sat quietly, still slightly dizzy, as Coach Thompson kept a protective hand on his shoulder. The coach's presence seemed to create a buffer between him and Officer Wilson, who now looked increasingly uncertain about his actions. A young girl in the crowd started crying, and her mother hugged her close. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, but everyone could hear her in the tense silence. "This is why we record. This is why we watch out for each other." The sound of squealing tires cut through the night as a police cruiser rounded the corner at high speed. Anthony recognized the sound of his father's car immediately. The slight whistle from the air intake that needed fixing. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path from the street to where Anthony sat on the curb. Officer Wilson's hand dropped from his holster as he turned toward the approaching vehicle. The expression on his face shifted from uncertainty to something approaching fear as he realized the full implications of what he had done. Coach Thompson helped Anthony to his feet, steadying him as he swayed slightly. The bump on his head throbbed, but more than the physical pain, he felt a deep ache in his chest. This was supposed to be his safe space, his neighborhood, his community. Now it felt like a movie set where a dark drama was unfolding. The crowd held its collective breath as another police cruiser rounded the corner, then another. The night air filled with red and blue flashing lights, painting the faces of the witnesses in alternating colors. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would change their community forever. The police cruiser's door opened before the vehicle had completely stopped. Chief Johnson stepped out, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The crowd fell silent, even the children's whispers hushed as they watched their police chief approach the scene. Unlike Officer Wilson's aggressive stance, Chief Johnson moved with calm purpose. His shoes clicked against the pavement, each step measured and deliberate. He took in everything at once, his son standing unsteadily beside Coach Thompson, the scattered belongings on the wet sidewalk, and the crowd of neighbors holding up their phones. "Dad," Anthony said softly, his voice carrying in the silence. The chief's steps quickened slightly at the sound of his son's voice, but his face remained composed. 20 years of police work had taught him the importance of staying calm in crisis situations, yet anyone who knew him could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Are you hurt?" Chief Johnson asked, reaching his son. His hand gently touched the back of Anthony's head where the bump was forming. When Anthony winced slightly, something flickered across the chief's face, a flash of pain quickly replaced by determination. Officer Wilson stood frozen, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. The nameplate on his uniform caught the light from the police cruisers, drawing attention to the slight tremor in his shoulders. "Chief, I can explain," Wilson started, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Chief Johnson's voice was quiet but carried the weight of thunder. "You didn't know that this young man you just assaulted is my son. Or you didn't know that what you were doing was wrong regardless of who he is." The gathered crowd watched in complete silence. Mrs. Thompson had lowered her phone, but others continued recording, capturing this moment of accountability. Mr. Rivera stood in his restaurant doorway, nodding slightly at the chief's words. "Sir, I was following protocol." Wilson tried again. "Protocol?" The chief's eyebrows rose. "Show me where in the protocol it says to empty a teenager's bag onto wet pavement. Show me where it says to ignore his ID when he tells you who he is. Show me where it says to use force when someone reaches for their phone to call their parents." Each question hit like a hammer, and Wilson seemed to shrink with each one. The red and blue lights from the police cruisers continued to flash, creating an almost theatrical effect as this drama unfolded. Coach Thompson stepped forward. "Chief, he hit his head when the officer pushed him. Might need to get it checked out." The chief nodded, his hand still resting protectively on Anthony's shoulder. He turned to one of the other officers who had arrived on scene. Call an ambulance. I want this documented. Lisa Chen, the reporter, had moved closer, her professional instincts warring with her personal feelings about the situation. She'd covered countless stories about police misconduct, but never one where the victim was the chief's own son. All of you, the chief addressed the crowd, his voice strong and clear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching out for my boy. Thank you for recording. He paused, looking at each face in turn. This is what community means. The tension in the air began to shift. What had started as fear and anger was transforming into something else, a sense of solidarity, of shared purpose. Several people began picking up Anthony's scattered belongings, carefully collecting his homework papers and basketball gear. Officer Wilson stood alone now, other officers maintaining a professional distance from him. His face had gone from red to pale, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. The same authority he had abused minutes ago was now turned back on him, but with justice rather than cruelty as its purpose. The wail of an approaching ambulance added to the symphony of police sirens. Chief Johnson turned back to Officer Wilson, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. Turn in your badge and gun. You're suspended pending a full investigation. The chief's words were firm but controlled. And Officer Wilson, this isn't just about my son. This is about every son, every daughter in this community. This ends now. The crowd murmured in approval. A few people clapped, then more joined in, the sound swelling like a wave. Anthony looked at his father with a mixture of pride and pain. Pride in seeing justice being served, pain in knowing that this incident would force their community to confront uncomfortable truths about power and prejudice. As the ambulance pulled up, its lights adding to the kaleidoscope of red and blue, the night air hummed with the energy of change. What had begun as one officer's abuse of power had transformed into a moment of community unity and the promise of reform. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire. People across the city were sharing the footage captured by dozens of phones, each angle telling the same story of injustice and community response. The local news stations ran the story as their lead, showing clips of Anthony on the curb, Officer Wilson's aggressive behavior, and the chief's powerful arrival. The hospital had cleared Anthony late last night. No concussion, just a nasty bump and some bruising. But the emotional wounds ran deeper than any physical injury. He sat at the kitchen table now, watching his father field endless phone calls while his mother prepared breakfast that no one would eat. The mayor's office again, Chief Johnson said, setting down his phone for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept at all. They want to hold an emergency town hall meeting tonight. Outside their house, news vans had started gathering. Neighbors formed a protective line along the street, turning reporters away with firm but polite words. Mrs. Thompson arrived with fresh flowers and muffins, Mr. Rivera brought coffee for everyone, and Coach Thompson stopped by to check on his player before heading to school. The basketball team is planning a peaceful protest, Coach mentioned quietly to Anthony. They want to wear black armbands at Friday's game, but they won't do it without your okay. Anthony nodded slowly, touched by his teammates' support. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from friends and classmates, all expressing their shock and solidarity. Even students he barely knew were changing their social media profile pictures to black squares with the hashtag #WestEndWithAnthony. The police department was in chaos. Officers who had worked with Wilson were being questioned about past incidents. Some defended him, claiming he was just doing his job, but others came forward with stories of concerning behavior they had witnessed but never reported. By afternoon, protesters had gathered outside the police station. Unlike the angry mobs some had feared, these were families with children, elderly couples, business owners, and students, the very fabric of their community. They carried signs reading "Protect our children" and "No more abuse of power." Local faith leaders arrived to ensure the protest remained peaceful. They'd formed a human chain between the protesters and the police station, not in opposition but in unity, showing that this wasn't about sides, it was about right and wrong. Inside the station, Chief Johnson faced the most challenging day of his career. He sat in his office, surrounded by internal affairs investigators, civil rights lawyers, and department heads. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just as a police chief, but as a father whose son had experienced the very thing he had worked so hard to prevent. "We need to make this right," he told his assembled staff, his voice firm. "Not just for Anthony, but for every kid who's ever been profiled, every parent who's ever had to have the talk with their children about how to survive a police encounter." The incident had sparked something larger than anyone expected. Other families began coming forward with their own stories of encounters with Officer Wilson and others like him. What had happened to Anthony had opened a floodgate of suppressed experiences and unspoken fears. Lisa Chen's article in the local paper went viral online, not just for its coverage of the incident, but for its deeper examination of systemic issues within law enforcement. She interviewed community members, police officers, and experts, painting a picture of a broken system that needed fixing. By late afternoon, the mayor called a press conference. Standing before a forest of microphones, she announced the formation of a special task force to review police training and procedures. Chief Johnson would lead the effort, working alongside community leaders and civil rights experts. "What happened last night was a wake-up call," the mayor declared. "But more importantly, it was a call to action. We can't change the past, but we can and will change the future." Back at home, Anthony watched the press conference on TV, surrounded by family and close friends. The bump on his head still hurt, but seeing his community unite in response to injustice gave him hope. His father's phone rang again. This time, it was a national news network wanting to interview them both. "What do you think, son?" Chief Johnson asked, hand covering the phone's microphone. "Ready to tell our story to a bigger audience?" Anthony looked around at the supportive faces in his living room. Coach Thompson nodding encouragingly, Mr. Rivera giving him a thumbs up, Mrs. Thompson wiping away tears. He thought about all the other kids who might face similar situations, about the change that his story could help create. "Yeah," he said finally, sitting up straighter. "People need to hear this. All of it." As the sun began to set on this transformative day, the community prepared for the emergency town hall meeting. Cars filled with families headed toward the community center, news crews set up their equipment, and social media buzzed with anticipation. What had started as one officer's abuse of power had become a catalyst for change, and everyone knew that tonight's meeting would be just the beginning. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening outside Mr. Rivera's restaurant. The community center buzzed with energy as people filed in for the graduation ceremony of the first class of police cadets trained under the new community-oriented program. Anthony stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone. The bump on his head had long since healed, but the experience had left him with something far more lasting, a purpose. Looking out at the sea of faces, he saw familiar ones from that night. Mr. Rivera recording on his phone just like he had done months ago, but this time with a smile. Mrs. Thompson dabbing proud tears from her eyes. Coach Thompson sitting tall in his chair. "When I was pushed to that curb 6 months ago," Anthony began, his voice clear and strong, "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But sometimes the worst moments in our lives become turning points for something better." The audience listened intently. Among them sat newly trained officers, community leaders, and even a few national news crews who had come to document what many were calling the community-first police reform model. Chief Johnson watched from the side of the stage, his face beaming with pride. The past months hadn't been easy. The department had undergone massive changes. Some officers resigned in protest of the new policies, while others embraced the transformation. The old guard was giving way to a new approach to policing. "Our new training program," Anthony continued, "isn't just about learning laws and procedures. It's about understanding the community you serve. Every cadet now spends time working in local businesses, mentoring at youth centers, and attending community events, not as officers, but as neighbors." Mr. Rivera nodded from his seat. His restaurant had become one of the places where cadets worked, learning to see the community through the eyes of its residents. The simple act of serving meals and chatting with customers had built more trust than years of traditional police work. Officer Wilson's actions that night were wrong, Anthony said, his voice firm but not angry. But they led to something important. They showed us that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. In the back of the room, a familiar face caught Anthony's eye. Officer Wilson sat quietly, wearing civilian clothes. After his suspension and the investigation, he had gone through extensive retraining and counseling. Now he worked with the department's new accountability unit, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and example of how bias can cloud judgment. The changes hadn't stopped at the police department. The town hall meetings that began in crisis had become monthly community forums where residents and officers could speak openly about concerns and solutions. Local businesses started a mentorship program, pairing young people with business owners who could guide them toward their dreams. Last week, Anthony shared, smiling, "I watched kids playing basketball with officers in the park. Not because of any program or requirement, but because that's what neighbors do. That's what community looks like." Coach Thompson had expanded his basketball program to include police officers as assistant coaches. The same court where Anthony had practiced now hosted weekly games where badges didn't matter, only teamwork and mutual respect. To the graduating class, Anthony turned to the cadets. "You're not just becoming police officers. You're becoming guardians of trust. Every interaction is a chance to build bridges, not walls. Every moment is an opportunity to show that protection and respect go hand in hand." The room erupted in applause. Mrs. Thompson stood up, starting a standing ovation that spread like a wave through the audience. Even the veteran officers who had initially resisted the changes were on their feet, recognizing that this new approach made their jobs safer and more meaningful. As Anthony stepped back from the podium, Chief Johnson took his place for the official graduation ceremony. Father and son exchanged a quick hug, no longer just family, but partners in transformation. The evening sun streamed through the community center windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Outside, the street where Anthony had once been humiliated now hosted community festivals and youth programs. The spot where he had sat on the curb had been transformed into a small garden maintained by residents and officers together, a living reminder that growth can come from the darkest moments. As the ceremony concluded and people mingled, sharing refreshments and stories, Anthony looked around at his transformed community. The incident that could have divided them had instead brought them together, creating something stronger and more beautiful than before. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was real, lasting, and built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. The sun set on another day in their changed community, but this time it set on a place where hope had replaced fear, understanding had overcome prejudice, and the badge meant what it always should have: a commitment to serve and protect all people equally and with dignity.